Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. As you all know, our two candidates tonight are Alderman Michelle Smith and Challenger Derek Lindblom. So I'm going to ask them to come on out onto stage. Let's give them a big hand. Good luck. Good luck. You know, it's always great to be here at Steppenwolf. I think most of us come here to see great performances on stage. We see performances that open our eyes, performances that change our perspective, and performances that touch our heart right here on this stage. Tonight, unfortunately, you've just got the three of us up here. But we have a money-back guarantee, so we'll fully refund your ticket price. There are four candidates who entered this race originally that did not make it to the runoff, but they all care about their community. Each worked hard, gave it their best. Each is deserving of our respect, and I'd like you to please join me in giving a big round of applause to Leslie Fox, Jacob Ringer, Rebecca Janowitz, and Stephen McClellan. Thank you. So we'll go over the rules. And first, I'll say that all of the organizations that sponsoring this debate are not-for-profits. We're all nonpartisan politically. We do not endorse any candidate, including that of 43rd Ward Alderman. Members of the audience are going to be asked to treat all candidates as well as other members of the audience with respect and to refrain from verbal interaction with other candidates or other audience members during this forum, this debate. Should an audience member become disruptive, we reserve the right to ask them to leave the auditorium. Due to the limited amount of time, please refrain from applause until the conclusion of the forum. Candidates are not allowed to text or otherwise communicate with their staff during this debate. So we have timekeepers here, and we worked with the candidates to see how they wanted the signaling to go. They will see a yellow signal when there's 15 seconds left and a red signal when time is up. And we're going to ask that the speaking candidate relinquish the floor when the time's up. They're allowed to finish their sentence, but the moderator will strictly enforce the time limits otherwise. Candidates, you're asked to answer the questions that you've been asked, not the questions that you want to have been asked. And if you don't answer the questions I ask, we'll move to the next question. So each candidate will have a 90-second opening statement. The order was determined by coin toss, and Derek Lindblom will give his opening statement first. Closing statements will be given in reverse order of opening statements. All of the questions will be asked in a rotating order. Following the opening statements, we'll have a series of questions that each candidate will be given 90 seconds to respond to. There will be no rebuttals during this phase of the questions. Following that round, we have three individuals from the neighborhood who were asked to read their specific question aloud. Two ended up with conflicts this evening, so I'll read their questions. The third neighborhood resident is here to read his question. Jerry Quant, where are you? There will be each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond to those questions with no rebuttal. Next, we will ask a series of candidate-specific questions on a rotating basis. The candidate to whom the question is directed will have 90 seconds to answer. The opponent will have a 60-second rebuttal, and the candidate to whom the question was originally asked will have 30 seconds to respond. Following the candidate-specific questions, the host organization will make a brief closing statement, during which time the candidates will work on their closing statements, and they will each have a 2-minute closing statement. Tonight I'll be referring to the candidates in their preferred manner. Alderman Smith, I'll refer to her as Alderman Smith or Alderman, and Derek Lindblom, I'll be referring to him as Derek. Alderman, Derek, good luck to you both. The first question, your opening statement. Derek, your opening statement. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you, and thank you for having me. Thank you to all the organizations that came together to host this today. I'm really excited to be here. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Derek Lindblom. I live up that way by Racine and Wrightwood. I live with my wife and our young son. I love this neighborhood. This is the neighborhood I moved to when I came home from school to Chicago. It's the neighborhood I kind of grew up in. It's where I met my wife. We couldn't afford a house here, so we moved out. We ended up saving up a down payment and moving back in. We wanted to raise our kid here. We love it here. It's a great place to be. I'm running because I care about this neighborhood. I'm running because I think we can make a real difference in our community and our city. I'm not your typical aldermanic candidate. I've done a lot of stuff, from working in the Senate Judiciary Committee on gun violence prevention, went to law school where I was president of the Harvard Law and Policy Review. Then I turned around companies in the private sector for several years. Ended up working at the city where I worked on our toughest issues like pensions and recruiting businesses and jobs to Chicago. And I've spent the last 5 years of my career starting healthcare technology companies, trying to use technology to make people healthier. I really care about modernizing the alderman's office, giving you the best service you possibly can, working on our local issues like vacant storefronts, and then also making a difference in the citywide issues that affect our community, things like safety, things like real ethics reform, including banning side jobs, instituting term limits, and then also really getting at the roots of the city's financial problems that have driven up your property taxes so much. I love our neighborhood. I love our city. I love our community. I think we can make this city and this community even better, but we have to run at our hard challenges and really make a difference on them. And I'm eager to talk about that with you tonight. Thank you for coming, and I look forward to talking.
Good evening. Can everyone hear? Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Many of you know me. I've lived in this neighborhood my entire adult life after graduating from the U of C Law School and being in the U.S. Attorney's Office. For 8 years, I've been working to reform our city. Because of that effort, the next mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, has endorsed my reelection. She said she needs me in city council. That's why Alderman Scott Wagasback, former Alderman Bill Singer, and Marty Oberman, all recognized leaders of reform, have also endorsed me. I'm grateful for their support, but there's so much to do. We must keep attacking the problems we focused on for the last 8 years, keeping our neighborhoods safe, making sure our infrastructure is addressed, and serving our constituents. The way we get there is standing up for transparency and ethics. We stand there by being honest stewards of taxpayer dollars. We get there by fighting against handing over $1.3 billion of your money for 23 years in the Lincoln Yards TIF. That money could go to repairing potholes, funding schools, and paying police. Leadership is not about keeping silent at every public meeting about Lincoln Yards and then meeting privately with developers. Leadership is standing for what is right when it counts, not jumping on a bandwagon. Please listen carefully tonight. Look who has specific accomplishments and plans and who offers vague assertions. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the evening.
I'd ask everybody again to hold their applause for both candidates until the end. It'll speed things up, give us time maybe for more questions. Alderman Smith, this is your question first. You each have 90 seconds to respond. This question is on crime. There's a perception within our ward that because we live in an affluent part of the city, we're being targeted by criminals who live in other parts of the city, and that the 43rd Ward does not receive nearly enough police resources. For example, there have been brazen muggings and carjackings at gunpoint that occurred during daytime hours, often in high-traffic areas such as on Halstead Street. In addition to adding police officers in the 18th and 19th districts, what other measures do you support to solve the increasing concerns about crime in our community?
Well, we've added a lot of resources. We've overcome all the issues regarding policemen who retired. We've added over 136 new police officers and new technology to reduce crime. And however, crime still continues. In fact, if you're on your cell phones, we just issued a community alert because a crew of people came into our neighborhood late last night and succeeded in some carjackings. It happened in a few hours. It's one crew. It's juveniles. So crime, and the real issue we have right now is we can have all the resources that we can get. We will always want more, but crime has to have consequences. And our office did a study showing that almost all juveniles arrested with a gun were released within 24 hours. And 42% of juvenile gun offenders are then arrested again within a year, and half of them for violent crimes. So this is an issue that has led to increased crime, particularly juvenile crime. And what we do know about the community alert that we just issued is that most or all of the offenders are juveniles. Our state's attorney is finally beginning to work with our 18th district on these repeat offenders and on these juveniles who are arrested and then released for violent crimes. But according to our commander, it's still not enough. So we're going to continue to the fight to get the resources, the best technology, and innovative solutions to make sure that we fix this spike in crime and return back to the way we are used to in our community.
Thank you. Derek?
So I think there's two principal causes of the crime increase we see in our community. And those feelings aren't without, placement in the facts. We've seen a 73% increase in assaults since the last election. We've seen over a 50% increase in sex crimes. We've seen an over 2/3 increase in motor vehicle theft. We have two principal causes. One is we lack effective deterrence. I'll give you an example. We solve murders, or the clearance rate, at about 17 to 18% in the city of Chicago. The national average is 64%. For shootings, it's under 5%. For many other property crimes and other assaults, it's actually even lower than that. We have to reinvest in our detective corps and invest in training so we can effectively solve crimes. We're not going to discourage people from doing crimes unless we have effective solutions. The second thing is we have to deal with the roots of crime. And that means things like bringing up communities that have challenges. That means things like viable options against crime. Things like increasing the minimum wage, which the alderman and I have a disagreement on. I think it's important we address the roots of crime while at the same time having tough, effective policing. We can do both. But it starts with training. It starts with being thoughtful and not reducing our number of detectives, but actually increasing how many detectives we have on the beat. We have to solve these crimes. Until actually just a little over a year ago, the city of Chicago had no mandatory police training after you left the academy. You could go through an entire police career from the late 80s without getting trained. As a result, we had people trying to solve crimes with the evidence on social media on flip phones. The fact is, things have changed, and we need to get ahead of technology with training and better resources.
Okay, Derek, this question starts with you, 90 seconds. When first introduced in 2017, the Chicago Fair Workweek Ordinance was not acted upon. A new version has now been brought forward which would exempt businesses employing fewer than 50 employees as well as existing bargaining agreements. There are pros and cons to this ordinance. Among other things, the ordinance would require that employers give employees 2 weeks advance notice of their work schedule. There's concern this would limit employee flexibility and have a negative impact on neighborhood restaurants, retail, and cultural institutions. If this ordinance comes up for a vote in City Council, would you vote yes or no? Please explain.
Sure. I think the ordinance needs work. I think there's some real questions around small businesses and medium-sized businesses being able to adjust their schedules fast enough. I don't really have an issue with saying to Starbucks or Walgreens that you should tell their employees a schedule a week in advance. And here's the reason why. We have a lot of folks who work at those stores who have to plan out childcare. Maybe they're trying to go to class at night. Maybe they're trying to do something you or I would take for granted, which is knowing vaguely when their working hours would be. Unfortunately, a lot of folks don't have that opportunity. And I think they need to look at options, like perhaps for very large companies, having things where you plan out your work week in advance and you just know a week in advance. Now, maybe it's one day can change, but it's not every day that can change. And I think giving folks that opportunity so they can plan their childcare is important. I think it goes with making this city a great city to work in. It goes with things like the minimum wage and earned sick leave, which I was proud to be a part of and on that task force. We have to make sure we're a city that gives viable alternatives to a life of crime and violence. We have to make sure that even low-wage jobs are good jobs that can support a family. And I think this is part of it. Now, let's not go overboard here. Let's not put a burden on small businesses they're not ready to take. But from our largest employers, the ones who have incredibly sophisticated technology, where they're already planning out how many people visit their store to the person, let's actually say, you know what, you can give your employees schedules a week in advance or so. That's not going to kill you. And I think it makes a real difference in people's lives.
Alderman?
Thank you. So this ordinance has been in the works for quite some time, and we're actually having a subject matter hearing, I think, in the next couple of weeks on it. The ordinance is not at all yet ready for prime time. The real industries that really are adversely affected by this are our hospitals and our health care. Places like Children's Memorial, hospitals that attend to a lot of Medicaid patients and our nonprofits have a serious problem with the ordinance because the nursing staff, which has flexible scheduling, sometimes needs to be accommodated to have a whole bunch of births or, unfortunately, trauma or things like that. And so our hospitals really have a lot of concerns about this, and I share those concerns because many of our nonprofit hospitals struggle. Many of our largest businesses like Walmart and Starbucks, already do have the things in place to be able to accommodate this kind of scheduling. So I hope that there can be a compromise reached that doesn't hurt small businesses and our healthcare industry, and yet can accommodate the needs of people to arrange things like childcare.
Thank you. Alderman Smith, you will start this question, 90 seconds each. Chicago public schools remain underfunded relative to suburban and other public schools throughout the state. Even though schools in our ward are well rated, the fact is that families are asked to subsidize funding provided by CPS for basic school supplies and teacher salaries. What specific plans do you have to improve funding for CPS public schools in our ward?
Well, my job as your alderman has been to advocate for our schools, and we've won over $60 million in aid to our schools, which is more in the last 7 years than we have had in the previous 40. That's one reason I ran for alderman, was to be able to advocate for our schools, to get us the facilities and things that we need for our schools. Now, one reason that we are having a problem with some of our school funding is really represented by the Lincoln Yards development. Because right now, that development, which will take all the virtually all the tax revenue that will develop, that will generate for the next 23 years, and that's $1.3 billion in estimated taxes, half of which would go to the schools. So I think that's a very serious question that we need to be asking. And that is one reason why we have really pressed to have actual answers on this topic. We've done so much to improve funding for schools already. That is why universal pre-K is spreading throughout our city. And universal pre-K is viewed as the #1 thing that we can do to improve the lives of underprivileged and at-risk families so that we do avoid crime and can create social justice and opportunity for everyone. So our job as aldermen is to advocate for our schools because, quite frankly, nobody else will. We have to fight for our schools, and I've been very proud to do so.
Time.
Thank you. You know,
Time.
it's a little hard to see, actually. Sure.
Derek?
So, I always joke this is something where I have a little bit of a conflict of interest in that I have a 2-year-old who will be at our public schools, so I care very deeply about this, and I think many of you in the audience do too. It's important that we fight for our public schools as hard as possible. Now, we've gotten some public school funding, but according to an independent study, we're actually in the lower half of wards when it comes to capital investment over the last several years. The challenges we have with our schools are both the physical buildings and making sure we have a steady funding stream. I talk to parents in this neighborhood all the time, and the thing they tell me is, you know what we want? We want school security. I want to feel like I have a great public school I can send my son or daughter to pre-K through 12. I don't want to have to worry that if they don't get into this school or that school, I'll have to leave my neighborhood or leave the city or start paying $30,000 a year for private tuition. I want to see a school system where I have that confidence that my child's going to be taken care of and get a great education. And I think that's critical to how we view this. I think part of this is also about just looking at the structure of how we set up our schools. First, it's about making sure adequate state funding is a key part of this. The plurality of our school funding comes from Springfield, and we need to fight hard down there to get our fair share of funding compared to the rest of the state. The second part of this is we need to make sure we use every dollar we have in every way it counts. And for me, that's a hybrid school board with some appointed and some elected members who can act as a check and a balance to help screen out corruption and screen out contracts or giveaways of money. We can do better, but we're doing great right now. And the reason is parents and principals who really care about our schools.
Time. Derek, you go first. You each have 90 seconds. Aldermanic prerogative placed too much power in the hands of one alderman in the case of Lincoln Yards, a result of all subject property being remapped into the 2nd Ward when the city redo ward boundaries in 2012. Without some form of aldermanic prerogative, however, every development in this and every other ward potentially would turn into a negotiation between our aldermen in all of the wards, resulting in deal-making and trade-offs that could severely compromise any development in the 43rd Ward. What specifically is the proper way to balance this concern?
So I think you struck the key word there in my mind, which is balance. The first thing is mega developments shouldn't be the property of one alderman. Mega developments that affect everyone in our area should be the property of all the aldermen in their area. I think that's especially important. But I'd say there's a second thing that I care about just as deeply, which is you can't have a system where every business owner is at the whim of the alderman when it comes to basic business functions. By that I mean renovation permits inside the store, things like awnings, things like sidewalk cafes, that in other places like New York are actually just administrative decisions that get made in 2, 3, or 4 days. Too often these decisions have to wait in an aldermanic office, and you don't know when they're going to get done. More importantly, they're a door to corruption in our system for folks like Ed Burke and others who have used it to hold up those permits until campaign donations came in. I think it's a tragedy we do it that way. So I would say 2 things. First, I'll advocate in the city council as a whole to make those administrative functions and give away that power. Second, locally, I'll focus on making sure you have what I call a service level agreement, or SLA, that businesses know how many days it takes me to turn around something. And if I don't say yes, I'll give you a written reason why, so you know I'm not holding you up for something. The one place I think we should keep some of the aldermanic prerogative, and Kenneth, I think you touched on that, is development in our ward. When we have small to medium-sized developments in our ward that don't affect other areas, we need an alderman who's going to protect our community and make sure that development fits in with the context of our community. I think that's still critical, and I think you can do that without getting rid of everything else.
Alderman?
So, the city tried to use aldermanic prerogatives as a shield to us having a seat at Lincoln Yards. And so we organized and created our own seat. And that is the reason why this has become controversial and important, is because we, the people in this room, went to meetings to create their own seat at the table. Now, I didn't see my opponent ever stand up at a meeting and say that we deserve to be heard. So we had to take matters in our own hand. Technically, Kenneth, what we need to do is to change the notice requirements so that people beyond a certain more than 250 feet have to get notice, and that their voices have to be heard. That's a very simple way to start the change, to make sure that large developments are heard by everyone. Although there have been other instances, from the Lucas Museum to the Children's Museum to even the Obama Center, in which people really were heard. And we're going to keep getting heard thanks to this community involvement. I do want to correct something Derek just said about these minor matters. I agree that we do not need to be signing off on every awning, sign, or anything like that. And we don't need an agreement saying how long it's going to take, because we turn them around in an hour. If someone brings in an agreement, we turn it out right away because we don't believe we should be involved in these issues. And I am a sponsor of the legislation to change it. I also just want to mention, since I have 15 seconds, that I did not oppose the minimum wage. I simply thought it should be county-wide. And it is now. And so now that's
Time. I'm going to give you each 45 seconds to expound further on how would you institute the change that you both say is needed with aldermanic privilege? Through an ordinance? What would be your specific way of convincing your colleagues on city council to think about it differently? And we'll just go in the same order we did on that question. Derek?
Sure. So I think there's a couple ways you do it. First, you have an administrative function that doesn't give notice or talk to an alderman as part of it unless there is a set veto point put in the system. And the second is a lot of this is tradition, so you need to break down that tradition. You start with a resolution, but you also put in a very clear voice of 26 aldermen who get up and say, we're not going to do it this way anymore. Once these things break down, it's almost impossible to build them back up. So I think what we have to do is start by breaking it down. I think you have to stop giving the departments the opportunity to say you have to go to the alderman. Once you say the aldermen say, hey, you don't have to come to us for each one of these, I think the departments will stop coming to you. And frankly, I think we shouldn't let them come to the alderman so you don't have that veto power in most of these administrative cases.
Well, certainly, people in our community ask me to use aldermanic prerogative all the time. That's how we protect our community. That's how we get community input. That custom is what allow our neighborhood groups and everyone in the room to come to meetings and have something to say. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. But what we do need to do, and that's why I made a specific suggestion, Kenneth, is to increase the legal notice requirement, because it is that, in fact, requirement that allows developers to hide, because they don't have to let people know. And when you have aldermen who don't who don't want to have community input. They hide behind that as well. I do also agree that prerogative should never be used for discriminatory purposes. This is some of these issues over affordable housing. But more importantly, the most important thing is to perhaps require neighborhood input.
Okay. Alderman, you're going to start with this one, answer this first. This campaign has been extremely negative, especially during the runoff phase. Whichever of you is fortunate enough to be elected, almost half of the ward is going to be disappointed, some bitterly so. Whichever one of you wins will have to govern a divided ward. What is your plan to heal the wounds, reunite the ward, and govern effectively in this challenging environment, which each of you has had a hand in creating?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the premise of that question. First of all, we meet regularly with everyone in the ward all the time. I've come to your condo meetings. I come quarterly with your neighborhood groups. Every election that isn't won by 70%, there's always people who are dissatisfied. And part of American democracy is recognizing that people in the majority work with the people in the minority. It's a lesson we don't quite have going on in Washington right now. But I think here in the 43rd Ward, we have a very good record of continuing to work with one another, regardless of who wins the election. And I think we will continue to do that. You know, I ran a very positive campaign until my opponent decided to make issues out of things that happened 5 years ago, about which there really is no issue anymore, as a means of trying to somehow demonstrate that he has ideas. And I have a record to run on that I'm proud of. I may not have made every perfect decision on earth by far, but we've talked about it, we've been transparent about it, and I'm really pledging to continue to do that with all your input and help to try to help our ward, improve our schools, improve our parks, keep going on public safety. And we'll just keep proceeding in that way as we have and as we have improved since our last election.
Thank you. Derek?
So I think the best way to confront a problem is to first acknowledge it exists. This has been a pretty rough campaign. I've had over $1 million spent against me on this campaign, some of it on positive ads, some of it on very, very negative ads about, personal things in my life, like when my family and I lived somewhere, or the fact that I supposedly had taken $300,000 from outside the ward when the alderman's taken $400,000 from outside the ward. I think when you're in these situations and you see this money spent, tempers can flare and, people can feel like something's going very wrong. But I think it's important to do what we've done in this campaign, which is focus on the policy. Focus on what matters. Focus on how does it affect you? Because look, at the end of the day, honestly, unless you're my wife out there, I don't think most of you really care what happens to us. You care what happens to your family. You care how high are your taxes? Are they going to affect you so you might have to move out of this ward? What's going on with crime in your community? Do you feel safe? You care about, are you getting the best representation in city council you can, or is your taxpayer dollars being siphoned off on other things? What really matters isn't us. And look, we're both adults. We know how this works. What matters is you. What matters is this a great place to raise your family, to grow old, to be happy here, to really enjoy it. So you know what? We'll be fine. I think as long as we focus on the issues, as long as we focus on your taxes, your safety, vacant storefronts in our community, and frankly, reforming city council, you'll get what you deserve, which is a great alderman.
Time. So on a related matter, I'd like to thank you guys for all the mail. I got a lot of beautiful mail from you guys, a lot of pretty pictures and nice papers, some of them not so pretty, but pictures, I mean. But the one thing as I look through these, I studied these things over the weekend, and these are just the ones that came in the runoff, and I tried to find where either one of you had said anything positive about the other. Now, even the worst among us has some redeeming quality. And there must surely be something about your opponent that you admire. So can you share something with our audience tonight that you most admire about your opponent? And I believe it's your turn, Derek, first.
Sure, actually, I find this pretty easy. Michelle Smith was an amazing lawyer at an early time when it wasn't easy to be a lawyer as a woman. I know because my mom and her actually went to the same law school. And she really, I think, blazed a trail. Did someone insist that? She really blazed a trail when it came to leading women in the law. I think that's awesome. I think that's a really cool thing, and I applaud her for it.
Thank you. Alderman?
Well, you know, Derek is a nice, ambitious young man who I'm sure will be, who I'm sure will, you know, take the experiences that he has thus far and move on to a successful career.
Thank you both. Okay, wait till it's over. Alderman, you'll go first on this. This is about the city revenue pension crisis. Both candidates have identified legalizing cannabis and casinos as a way for the city to increase revenue to address the pension crisis facing our city. What other plans or solutions do you see to increase revenue to account for the pension crisis?
Well, the pension crisis has really evolved because we had to raise property taxes a few years ago when the pension plan that my opponent has touted, has been the creator of, failed, and we were forced to raise property taxes. And this is something we talked about in 2015, that there was a state law that if it passed, if pension reform was not successful, and when it wasn't successful, required taxes to be raised. And we talked about that in my newsletter at the time, and the mayor even said that we had to use specific property tax revenue in order to raise money for police and fire. So now things are different, and I strongly support, as part of a grand bargain, a constitutional amendment to restrict cost of living increases, which are the strongest, biggest driver of our pensions. We also must continue to work on reducing the cost of government, which I've actually done as your alderman, reducing the cost of government by millions of dollars by reducing absenteeism in our government. We also have to continue to work with our assessor to make sure that properties are assessed fairly. As we know, the downtown properties are underassessed by $1 billion, the top 10 buildings. And we also need to continue to work on the other sources of revenue, such as cannabis, which I believe should be in a lockbox for pensions. Certainly, casino gambling is now very much on the table because our constituents support it. And we will continue to work in all different forms with our new governor to try to make this work. Thank you.
Derek?
So I think it's important to start with this, because this has been at the crux of a lot of the debate between the aldermen and I. I led on this pension reform legislation in 2014. I've talked about it a lot because I think it gets to the heart of the biggest issue the city has, which is pension and debt liabilities. I negotiated a compromise between 28 out of 31 city unions that was endorsed by the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times, and Crane's Chicago Editorial Board, along with the business community and pretty much everyone in government. Now, recently, Alderman Smith has taken to really criticizing this and saying this was a horrible idea. But the fact is, you know how I know it was a great idea, is even Alderman Smith at the time wrote an op-ed in Crane's Chicago about how great it was and said it was urgent that Governor Quinn sign it as quickly as possible. This gets to the core of the issues between the two of us. Even as a staffer, I was willing to take political risk by tackling the biggest and hardest issue I could find because it mattered the most for our community, because it matters the most for our future as a city and as a neighborhood. I think it's easy to be with it when the wind blows one way and then say later, well, I didn't like this, I didn't like that part, you should have done this better. The fact is, we need to be about big ideas because we got big challenges. We need to be about things like tackling our hardest problems like pensions. If we don't go after these issues head on, if we don't tackle them, if we don't make a difference and try to bring people together at a table and make a compromise like I did, we're never going to succeed. I'm proud of my involvement in that. I'm proud Alderman Smith wrote an op-ed endorsing it.
Derek, you go first on this. Mayoral candidate Bill Daley and obviously several others have supported the reduction of wards and number of aldermen in Chicago. This change would bring Chicago in line with such cities as Los Angeles that have larger populations but fewer members of the city council. The goal of such proposals is to reduce redundancy, bureaucracy, and save the city millions of dollars. Would you support such a reduction? Why or why not?
Sure. This question gets to kind of the heart of the structure of city council, and I think where we have some significant policy disagreements. So I would support reducing the size of council. Kenneth, you mentioned in your question, but the average for top 10 cities besides Chicago is 17 people in city council. If you adjust for population, it's 20. We have 50. I don't think there's very many people that think Chicago City Council has performed so well that we should stay being an outlier. We could afford hundreds and hundreds, 400 to 500 perhaps, more teachers or police officers. Instead, we hire more politicians. To me, that doesn't make any sense. I think we need to fundamentally change the nature of city council. I think the easy things you can automate and you can make administrative practices like awnings, we should do downtown. I think you should have aldermen only do the hard stuff like local development. I think what you can do is you can put yourself in a situation where you really reform that structure, reduce the number of people in city council, use the money on teachers and cops, really ban side jobs and have real ethics reform, and then put in term limits so we don't have the same folks there year after year who are making the same bad decisions. We're not at a point where we can afford to fiddle around the edges. We're at a point where we have to change the structure of the system. I think it starts with being good stewards of your money, and that starts by hiring less politicians and more teachers and cops. Thanks.
Alderman?
Well, I think the people should vote on it. I think that people should vote on whether or not they want to reduce the size of city council, because I know that my constituents rely on our office to advocate for them instead of working with a faceless bureaucracy. I certainly don't think that we want to turn ourselves and the way we deliver constituent services into a giant Comcast customer line, which is what happens when aldermen don't play that advocacy role for our constituency. It also increases the power of downtown to have less aldermanic involvement in the decisions that affect our daily lives and less role in fighting for the things that we care about. So if the people want to do it, I'm all for it. Since I've become alderman, I've seen how much people depend and need our office, as they have every other alderman before me, to try to advocate for them. And that is a unique feature of Chicago, and it's actually a good one. At the same time, many administrative functions like awnings and signs, we probably don't need to be involved in, although my folks in the historic district might disagree, and we want to maintain the character of our communities. But I think it's more important that we elect the right kind of people with good records of reform so that we can have these things not just talked about, but actually come into place. And that's what I intend to do with Lori Lightfoot when we take office in May, to begin to make the changes that have really, we've been thwarted in making by an entrenched leadership that's been there for a long time.
Did you already went on that, Darrell?
Yeah, I went first on
You
that
went
one.
first.
Okay, I'm going to ask, we have a
Glad it was so
couple,
memorable.
okay, we have a couple more here. I'm going to ask if you can limit your answer to these to 60 seconds, because we can get them both in and stay on schedule if you can limit it to 60 seconds. And Alderman, you'll go first. What specifically will you do to address the growing concern that there may be lead in Chicago's drinking water, including the drinking water present in public schools and parks?
Sure. Well, certainly for the public schools and parks, we need to actually make investments in infrastructure to replace the old water fountains in those parks, because kids deserve to have good water. And those are always because of old structures inside the schools. Inside our homes, I think we need much more study to understand the problem. Right now, water is completely 100% clean when it leaves our plant, and when the chemicals are put in that water, it's completely clean. But we've had a few instances in our ward in which, and only a few, in which lead was found inside the home. And the Chicago Water Department takes these very seriously, and there might be some people in this room who've been through the process of having their home evaluated, and in a couple of cases found that there was some upstream old valve or something like that that needed to be replaced. Our neighborhood is a particular issue because we have so many homes that are really old. The sentence. And yet, our problem has not been that great.
That's the second sentence. Okay.
I'm going to finish this sentence.
Derek?
Thanks. So this is a real issue, and look, I think anyone like my family with a young kid knows this is something you worry about, because lead really affects the development of child's brains. And so it's something, how do you work on it? How do you care about it? Well, we made some mistakes in Chicago historically. We actually kept putting in lead pipes until 1986. We were the last major city to do so. So we were installing lead well after we knew what the dangers were. That was a huge mistake. As a result, we have a lot of lead service lines in Chicago. Those aren't the main lines. It's the service line from the line down the middle of your street to your house. Now, what's the good news? It's not cheap to fix. It's probably somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 for most houses. But the vast majority of that cost is opening up the street. Once you open up the street, it's actually not that expensive. So what we should do is we should give property owners the ability, when your street's being worked on for ComEd, for People's Gas, for fixing the main water mains or anything else, if they're opening it up, you can chip in the cost of how much it would cost to fix your service lines, and we should do that for you. Give homeowners the option.
Time. So Derek, you go first on this one, and again, I'd like you to each limit your answer to 60 seconds. Now, I've looked at both of you's donor lists pretty closely, and you know, there's a lot of developers, there's architects, there's lobbyists, there's unions on both sides. So this question is asked in that context. Currently, there's a lack of transparency in the way ordinances are created, debated, and presented for votes in City Council. For example, Rule 14 allows Chicago Alderman present at City Council votes to recuse themselves from the vote if they have a financial conflict of interest. There's no requirement to disclose this information prior to the vote. Alderman Ed Burke, for example, has recused himself hundreds of times when a proposal comes up for a vote, but not before when this information could be crucial to the impact of the ordinance. As Alderman, what changes, if any, would you propose to increase transparency and the guarantee of ethical practice, but also your personal policy when somebody who's donated a significant amount of money comes before you with a project that benefits them?
Sure. You know, we've joked about this on this campaign. I'm running against $1 million campaign. And we start to get a lot of questions about, well, do you get money? Where do you get money? And we've talked about it. It's mostly folks in the community. We have more small dollar donors than we think any other aldermanic campaign in the city. I also have some folks, this being Lincoln Park, whose smaller dollar donations end up being quite big. But we're not at $1 million yet. It's kind of saying to, you know, Goliath claiming that David is too well armed. But, you know, this is how politics and campaigns work, and it's really important to get at the core of this corruption. It starts with a couple things. Number one, if we have someone who's donated money to our campaign, we have an outside board of neighborhood leaders from the neighborhood associations who can review and make an official recommendation. It's not about taking money from the developer and architect and lawyers around Children's Memorial or Sterling Bay's property tax lawyers, DLA Piper, like my opponent has. It's about instead having the community have that voice. And secondly, I think you have to ban all aldermanic side jobs. You're going to have too many issues with conflicts of interest in Rule 14 if you don't. We need no aldermanic side jobs, and that's the best way to do it.
Time.
So I've been a leader in ethics reform in the city for my entire career, including oversight of city councils and now trying to eliminate these Rule 14 issues by making aldermen give up their committee chairmanships if they have, I think the current proposal is 3. So I've never had any ethical conflict of interest. I've never had to invoke Rule 14. And most importantly, there's never been any question about any zoning decisions that I've made, because my policy has been that I don't accept developer contributions when things are under consideration. So in contrast, my opponent has accepted $10,000 from Sterling Bay's attorneys. Does that mean you're going to exempt yourself from a decision on Lincoln Yards? You know, there's an old saying that Lyndon Johnson once said that I cannot quite repeat, but it's basically, if you can't accept a contribution and then vote against them, he said it a little more crassly, you don't belong in the business. And let me tell you, I'm also not running a $1 million campaign. We do raise campaign contributions to fund our ward office, to some of the employees, and Mr. Derek has outraised me in this campaign.
Okay, that ends this phase of the debate, and I know everybody's dying now to give applause and everything, so give a big round of applause before we move to the next phase. So the next phase is going to be very similar, except we selected 3 people who had submitted questions to actually ask their own questions. Alan, we didn't pick you, I'm sorry, because we wanted the mic back.
He asks every day.
So two of the 3 individuals whose questions were selected were unable to be here tonight, so I'm going to read it for them, and then we're going to hand a microphone to Jerry Kwan, who's familiar with the microphone, and let him ask his directly. So a gentleman named John Bruce Ye, who asked this question, and he's on the musician with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and they had a free performance tonight. But his question was, What solutions will you implement in order to fill vacant storefronts in our ward, specifically those on Halstead Street and Armitage Avenue, with high-quality businesses? Please be specific.
I can't remember who's first.
You know what? Neither can I.
Was it me? I think it is me.
I think it is you.
Oh,
Yeah.
did you just go? Yeah, you're first.
It's me.
You for-
So we have had a very specific strategy for vacant storefronts that we have been running now for several years since the recession, and here it is. First, Armitage Avenue. We rebranded the store. Go on Armitage. It's full. There's one vacancy. Took many years. It is now the #1 place in the Midwest for clicks to bricks retail. That is internet businesses that need a presence, and is doing just fine because lots of tourists come as well. So that development still has to come around to Halstead some. However, I walked down Halstead this weekend and counted 7 stores that have building permits or brown paper indicating that they're under construction. So Halstead's a little bit slower, and we're getting there. Lincoln Avenue we solved by creating the Lincoln Common development to create a new neighborhood crossroads for our community when our largest employer left and wiped out Lincoln Avenue. And right now, you're all beginning to enjoy the new stores and new restaurants. Bobby's, new restaurants are coming in, and every store in the Lincoln Common development will be rented, providing that energy that our community needs. And finally, for Clark Street, we will be installing in May new wayfinding signage, because the problem with Clark Street is that there isn't enough foot traffic, and the wayfinding will bring people from the beach and the zoo to come to Clark Street. And finally, we're working with our assessor, Fritz Kagi, to get rid of the loophole that allows property owners to keep their properties vacant, which is one of the biggest problems on Clark Street.
Time. Derek?
Sure, I have to do this quickly, but I think it's incredibly important. I don't think signs is going to cut it. I think that's part of the reason we've had a problem for the past 8 years, and Clark and Halstead are in such difficult shape. I think this is why we need change. 1, we have to actually fix the tax code that rewards landlords for keeping properties vacant in the long term. We shouldn't be giving a bonus to landlords who want to keep their property vacant on their property taxes. 2, we have to make sure vacant properties are still good landlords. They have to do things like get rid of their snow, make sure the property is secure, make sure it's not deteriorating. If they don't, we have to fine them. And then 3, and I think this is incredibly important, we're in the age of Amazon. They just need a different amount of retail per person than we used to. We're in a hole we have to stop digging. The first thing we have to stop doing is building so much new retail. We built 130,000 square feet of retail with the children's development. That's way too much retail for a neighborhood that can't support the retail it already has. We need to move in, when we did that development, we need to take the residential and help it with the retail that already exists. Even if we fill all that commercial space, we're just cannibalizing from other parts of our community and making more vacant storefronts. Let's be more thoughtful about how much retail we really need per person in the age of Amazon. Let's make sure vacant storefronts are good citizens in our community, and let's fix a broken tax code. And finally, property taxes are driving too many people on triple net leases out of business and stores. Let's stop voting for new property tax increases so our stores have a chance along with our homeowners.
Thank you. Resident Peter Jacobs, who was unable to be with us tonight, says the sewer grates in Lincoln Park seem to be made to fail every time it rains. The only way for water to drain from the streets is through thin slits in the manhole covers, which are flush with the street and quickly clog with leaves and other debris. This necessitates someone to stand over the manhole cover and rake or sweep to clear the clogged slits. Why won't the city install storm drains in the curbs, which can drain the water even if the grate area is flush with the street gets clogged? I have asked this question to the city and the Alderman's office, but never received a response. Derek, I believe you go first on that.
Yeah, I think it's me on this one. So I don't know about your street. I live on a 1 block long dead end street, for those of you who don't know it, and it floods all the time. We drive through it, it stinks. And it gets really, really smelly out there, and there's a lot of young children on our street who seem to always want to, if they're like my son, try to run into the water. What we have to do is we have to have more sophisticated storm drain technology. There's other cities that have upped their storm drains so less things get caught in them, and they're able to better drain water through leaves. They have a better catchment basin built into the drain. I'm not going to start, wonking it out too much on infrastructure here, but a policy wonk like me loves this stuff. It costs a little more short term, but it lasts longer, and the investment is well worth it, not only in better upkeep and, less expensive future upkeep and a better upkeep cost, but more frankly, in that we won't have flooded streets and flooded street corners. I'll give you an example. Racine and Wrightwood, that corner has been flooding for so long. I joke with my wife, when I first moved in after school, that corner used to flood, and it continues to do so. We have to replace these, and we should be replacing them as we replace the main water mains. I think it would make a huge difference if we took a proactive approach to this.
Alderman?
Well, those new storm drains were a requirement of the Americans with Disabilities Act, excuse me. The Americans with Disabilities Act. And, these legal requirements were the subject of a big lawsuit against the city. So the city was required to change those drains because the grates were too large, and you can figure that out. So this has been a problem that is a direct result of the fact that our infrastructure, that immediate issue, and that our infrastructure is very, very old and very, very expensive to replace. This is really a funding issue. And our funding for some basic things like repairs are threatened when our property taxes are taken away by things like big TIFs. So these are some of the decisions that we have to make every day. Now, I don't know, I've lived in the neighborhood a long time, and it has always been true that part of being a good neighbor is raking the leaves out of a drain. Longtime residents can raise their hands. And I think part of being a neighbor is, in fact, being part of the help that helps our community. This is an issue that is 100% a budget issue, and we have to find the funding to be able to continue to work on these problems. And secondly, of course, it's another issue, the fact that we now have a lot more rain in our communities than we ever did. And part of the reason why we strongly favor green infrastructure as much as possible, whenever we can do it, like alleys and parkways and things like that.
Okay, sorry about that. It's like a gun going off. So the next question that we selected for a resident to ask was from Jerry Quant, and if you know Jerry, there was no way he was going to miss being here in person to ask it. So, Jerry, I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, and thank you to both the candidates. My question relates to transportation and mobility. The mayor just released a report from the Transportation and Mobility Task Force last week. I know both of you have a copy of this report. The task force was comprised of a wide array of experts chosen across mobility, technology, planning, and equity from both here in Chicago and many who are experts that are nationally recognized. The report consists of a comprehensive list of policy recommendations, action items, and research projects to prepare our city and our neighborhoods for more safe and efficient mobility. Of this very comprehensive list, which are the most important to our ward in the next 4 years, and what are you going to do to facilitate the implementation of those specific initiatives you find most important in your first 100 days?
I'm not sure whose turn. Is it my turn? So, Jerry, nice to talk to you. So transportation and mobility is actually a big issue in our ward. We are blessed, actually, by having one of the wards with the most access to public transportation in the city. And so we need to encourage the more efficient use of public transportation. So, for example, we need to continue to work on some inexpensive fixes that are really important, like changing the locations of bus stops so they're not stuck at lights, or clearing parking during rush hours to make sure that buses can move very quickly. Those are some of the things that actually just make our lives better every day. I think we also are going to need to look at this relationship now we have with Uber and Lyft, which is really pretty much responsible for the new congestion that we're suffering in our city and downtown. At the same time, we still face this very critical issue of dealing with the L and the fact that we don't have the Circle L, which people have been talking about for a long time, to be able to take people west of us to downtown. And that's a particular issue because at Lincoln Yards, the Lincoln Yards Mass Transit Plan is really terrible. And it really relies on roads and parking and a boat and a metro station instead of requiring the L. And finally, Jerry, I think that we still suffer an issue right here in our ward about biking. You know, if you're a car driver, you're terrified of the cyclists. If you're a cyclist, you're terrified of the bikers. And we need to continue to work within the narrow confines of our difficult old streets to try to make cycling safer.
Okay. Dirk?
Hi, Jerry. So I think, you know, look, there's a bunch in that report that's really important to talk about. I think there's a really good section in that report about new technologies and how we integrate and use new technologies that, you know, frankly, 60, 90 seconds isn't enough to talk about. But transportation technology is going to change. It changed about 10 years ago. We see a lot more with Uber and Lyft, and it's going to change again with autonomous vehicles and a lot of other issues City Council is going to have to deal with over the next 4 to 8 years. And I think we need to be thoughtful on those issues and figure out how do you do this in a safe and effective way. But let me talk about some issues that are very much right now. The first is pedestrian safety. We have a real issue with pedestrian safety in our ward. Around Oscar Mayer, for example, the local public school for my neighborhood, we've had multiple kids get hit outside the school. It's a real scary thing. We had a 19-year-old woman who also got hit and fairly seriously injured. We have to make some real hard decisions about how do you fix these high-traffic, high-speed areas that go by tons of pedestrian traffic. Chicago has an abnormally large amount of pedestrian hits in our neighborhood and across the city. You look at cities like New York or Stockholm, Sweden, and they've reduced it to near zero in Stockholm, and New York has gone way down. We need to have a similarly aggressive Vision Zero plan to make a huge difference in what's happening. Because we can't walk around with our families. We can't have seniors walking around when we have these folks gunning down the street at 45 miles an hour and they're not being slowed down. And I think that would be my first priority in the first 100 days.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. Okay, we're headed into the phase of the debate now where there's some candidate-specific questions. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer. Their opponent will have 60 seconds to rebut, and then the candidate who got the question originally will have 30 seconds to reply to the rebuttal. First question is for you, Derek. While most of the candidates who ran for 43rd Ward Alderman said they supported legalized casino gambling in Chicago to generate revenue for the city, only you went a step further and proposed legalizing sports gambling in Chicago, even at venues such as Soldier Field. Statistician Thomas Boswell wrote the following in the October 5th, 2018 issue of the Washington Post. If you want to damage a sport, sour the public toward its games, while also maximizing the amount of money lost and the number of addicts created, then legalize sports betting. If you want to magnify the attention paid to the lowest and most cynical motives of the audience, rather than emphasizing the skill, hard work, and integrity of the athletes, just legalize betting on people the way we now bet on horses and dogs. Many experts agree. Tell us why you believe legalized sports gambling would be the right thing to do for the residents of our city.
Sure. So I think this is a fairly, for me, direct issue when it comes to how we generate revenue. We're going to have two options to generate revenue. One, we're going to have creative solutions like casinos and sports betting and cannabis tax. Two, we're going to have the traditional options that the status quo city council has used in the past, and that's things like raising your property tax. And I'm willing to do other creative, interesting, different options instead of raising your property taxes, because I think it chases out families and seniors from our community. Now, so my thinking on sports betting is modeled after what they're doing at the Meadowlands in New Jersey, where the Jets and the Giants play. It's very simple. You have a betting area in the sports complex, in this case the Meadowlands, where you bring in tax revenue from that betting. You can do it in a contained area, and you can make a surprisingly large amount of revenue. This is important because we can have suburbanites who attend these games, come in, have a couple beers, gamble on the games, and pay for our schools. At the end of the day, I massively prefer that to a property tax increase. Look, our choices aren't great choices here. We don't have easy solutions. They're all gone. We have to take on tough things like our pension and debt liabilities. We have to take on tough questions like, do you want sports betting or do you want a property tax increase? I'm a no on a property tax increase, and that's what leads me to be a yes on sports betting.
Alderman, you have 60 seconds.
Well, I don't think the choices are that digital, and I really doubt anyone in the audience thinks it's sports betting or property taxes. I just don't think that's true. I do know that Derek enjoys the support in his campaign contributions from people who are really in that industry. And I'll say that it is concerning. We're all very uncomfortable about casinos. I think people would rather legalize cannabis than legalize casinos because we know the impact that it can have on families. But let's talk about revenue and talk about what we need to do for our city. So I will absolutely not vote for another property tax increase. I think that we've given enough, and I think there are the solutions on the table that I've already discussed. But I don't think that sports betting may be the right thing to do because there are other alternatives.
Derek?
So I agree with the alderman on not raising our property taxes. I agree when she said it 4 years ago. And then 6 months later, she voted for the largest property tax increase in city history. We need to be aggressive about solving these financial problems. If we're not, you're going to come to the solution again where your property taxes are raised on you. It's time for a change in the status quo city council. And that change starts with not raising your property taxes anymore and pushing more and more people out of our community. It starts with an alderman who will keep their promises. And when they say no property taxes, they'll mean it.
Thank you. Alderman, the next candidate-specific question is to you. And the last question is about sports gambling. Somehow it turned into property taxes. So there is a relation, I suppose. And this question is about property taxes. They continue to be a concern, an issue for long-term residents of the neighborhood. In addition to promising not to raise property taxes again, what would you propose to help residents stay in their home? Please be specific.
Sure.
And there's a second part to that, which is a lot of people 4 years ago thought they heard a commitment from you that you would not raise property taxes. Now that commitment is being made again. So could you address those two?
Well, Kenneth, let me be clear. What I said in writing is I would not consider any property tax increase until every single possible alternative has been exhausted. And when it came to every other issue with our pensions, when Derek's deal was struck down unanimously by the Supreme Court, we did do other alternatives. In order to meet our municipal and laborers unions, we raised other revenue. We raised the water tax, and we raised a phone tax. But police and fire pensions, specifically under state law, were required to be raised by property taxes. The mayor said so at the time, and I told everyone about my vote. It's right on our website when we did that vote. So let's lay that issue to rest about this so-called fake promise that this guy is talking about over here. But what we do have to talk about is that there are other opportunities out there. There are other things that we can do, and I have talked about what those other options are. You know, Lori Lightfoot even talked about possibly taxing big law firms, like Derek's folks, or hers, or doing things to make sure that people who use services. That is something that the Illinois legislature has considered before. We're one of the few states in the union that don't have service taxes. So I think there are a lot of alternatives that we can consider, and I'm very, very clear that we have given enough at the office when it comes to property taxes, and so I will not vote to raise property taxes.
Under any
period.
circumstances?
Under any circumstances, I've been quite clear. And finally, let me also add.
Time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Derek?
This guy over here's turn.
This guy over here.
So, first, I got to tell you, I know we both want to win. I know we really want to win.
Yeah.
Don't go after my parents. Don't go after my mom. Don't go after my folks.
You were-
Yeah, I think it's inappropriate. I agree.
You said I was old.
I never did that. That never happened. You're the one who told me you went to school with my mom. I think it's very important to keep this at some level of civility. I really do. You know, look, I think when it comes to the property taxes, we have a policy disagreement. We have a very simple policy disagreement. I think Alderman Smith, and I think the key words there were in writing, told a lot of you that she wasn't going to raise your property taxes. And frankly, I think if you look at the news reports at the time, it's very clear. I think when we're looking at these issues, you can make the judgment how credible that promise is today. I don't think it's very credible. I think we need someone new who's going to come in and change that status quo liability, status quo mentality of tell you one thing and do the next. Because I don't think we should raise your property taxes. I think it's too much. I think it's too far. I think you've already paid enough. And I don't think you can trust the idea that we're not going to raise them again unless we look at other options. We talked about sports betting. I think there's others. Aldermen get a special aldermanic annuity. They get this special thing where they can almost double their pension compared to a teacher or compared to a firefighter for the same level of service and salary. Let's start taxing that. There's a lot of other ideas just like that, where we can get these taxes on things where it's furnishing those special interest perks. I don't think starting to raise them on businesses or targeting specific businesses because they're unpopular is the way to go. I think you got to actually focus on how do you get it out of people, things like casinos, things like cannabis tax, and also reducing the size of duplications in government.
Time. Alderman, do you have
I think 30 seconds.
30 seconds?
To respond.
Yes.
Oh,
You can forfeit it.
no,
I mean,
no,
you
no,
can- you
I
can
didn't know I had
waive
30
it.
seconds, excuse me, I'm sorry. So Derek, I'm sorry, honey. We do get sharp elbows sometimes, and I've heard an awful lot of mean things said about me, and sometimes they hurt. But what we really have to do here is actually go out and do our jobs. And the most important thing is that we focus on the real problems today. And being told over and over and again that one breaks her promises when actually you've been consistent does wear after a while. Constantly being this thing about aldermanic pensions, I don't qualify for that. So it's a sideways jam, and sure, if aldermen are abusing the system,
Time.
they shouldn't have.
Time. Okay, this next question is, start with you, Derek. It's for you, and you'll have 90 seconds, and then it'll be 60 and 30. In campaign mailers and in your appearances, you have focused much on city government, made references to your time working in Washington for Senator Schumer, and expressed your support for a woman's right to choose, which, while both admirable in the law of the land, is outside the purview of a local alderman. Some worry that your ultimate ambition lies beyond the 43rd Ward, and if you win this election, it would merely be a stepping stone to run for higher office. What is your commitment to the voters in Lincoln Park that you would first focus on priorities in this ward rather than ambitions to serve in another position?
Sure. I actually am really glad I got this question because I think sometimes there's been some questions, either whispered about me or said about me, like, why is he doing this? What is he trying to get? And the answer is really simple. I'm trying to be your alderman. I love this neighborhood. It's funny, I see some of my neighbors in the audience, and I'm that guy who's always talking about what's going on in the community. I'm that guy who's standing in front of the house that's been under construction for 2 years trying to figure out what the heck's going on. I'm the guy who's always talking about what the new restaurant is and have we tried it yet and what's going on with this building. I think when you look at my career and what we've talked about, I do have the benefit of some real national experience serving on the staff of the Senate Judiciary Committee, working on issues like gun violence, both nationally and how it affects local communities. But for me, it was about moving home. It was about coming back here to Chicago. For those of you who know me, I'm not going to make any pretensions about this. I'm kind of a dork. I'm kind of a policy nerd. I love things like infrastructure. I love things like talking to you for hours about why the 1986 decision to finally get rid of lead pipes in Chicago has actually contributed to a reduced crime rate in the early 2010s. Like, I love that stuff because I think it really matters in our lives. And one of the reasons I'm so excited to be alderman is because it's about solving your problems. It's about hanging out with my neighbors. It's about spending time in my local community. I think it's the best job it could be. I've done the DC thing. I've fought that trench warfare. I think the city's where you make real change. And I think here in our community is a wonderful place to make an impact for my family and my neighbors.
Time. Alderman?
So I suppose I had the reasons of running for alderman, wanting to serve the community at the request of some of my neighbors. And after I was in Washington, and after I worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office for these many years, I decided to give back. Now, with regard to Derek, the only reason these questions are come up is because you've said it to a bunch of people that your aim is to start a political career and someday run for Congress. That's the reason that these rumors got started. So, my ambition is to be your alderman. I've been here for 40 years now. I've lived here my entire adult life. I have no further ambition than to continue to finish the work that we have started. So sometimes some people do view alderman as a stepping stone. I view it as my public service.
Derek?
That's just outright untrue. I have never said that. The reason you keep hearing it is because Alderman Smith's campaign has started a whisper campaign about this. And I think it's really kind of ugly if you think about it. The whole message behind it is he's too good for you. And I think that's crazy. I think you deserve the best alderman you could possibly have. I think you should have someone who's really working at these issues, someone who has a track record of success, someone who works incredibly hard. I think you should be incredibly proud of who your alderman is. You should say, that's my alderman in city council, fighting on the hardest issues, going after the toughest problems.
Time. Okay, this question is for Alderman Smith. You have stated that crime and public safety is the #1 issue facing our ward. Yet those words don't appear anywhere in any of the mailers you've sent during this runoff. Over the last few years, unless it was in today, the ones that came in today's mail, I haven't read those word for word. I have read the others word for word.
Actually, that's
so
not
just to be fair, I haven't read today's. Over the last few years, you've held press conferences, formed coalitions, and rallied ward residents to appear at City Hall to testify in favor of park space and other matters. You have not, however, held press conferences, formed coalitions, or rallied residents to testify at City Hall about the neighborhood's crime concerns. If crime truly is the #1 issue facing the ward, why hasn't it been your most visible priority as alderman? If reelected, how would you make sure the #1 issue facing the ward is your most important priority?
So I'll just correct this, Kenneth, to say that on the literature that we hand out at everybody's door, we talk about it. And also, we have a video up that's been seen thousands of times talking about what we're doing on public safety. And plus, I think 25,000 people in our ward get my newsletter every single week in which we talk about what we're doing on crime. I don't have to resort to promises or statements in a campaign mailer. We're doing the work every day. We've been doing the work for 7 years, and in the last couple years, when these new problems have emerged, we've had meetings, CAPS meetings, special CAPS meetings, special safety meetings. We had them at Cortland Commons. We've had at the Old Town Triangle. We have been working on this issue very hard, having community meetings at Lincoln Park High School, at other locations, whenever there's been a problem. So I really don't feel that it's a requirement for a sitting alderman to put things in their campaign mailers. What we have to talk about is we're doing the job right now. And I'm really proud of the job we're doing against a very, very difficult issue. So we've been getting the resources, in fact, been working hard, having sort of mano-a-mano meetings with our state's attorney to try to get them to do their job. Having really, really tough conversations with our commanders about what we need to do. They just announced last week that they're doubling resources in Old Town because of a spike there. So I don't think this is a topic for campaigning. It's a topic for doing.
Sure. You've seen me talk about this a lot at every debate, in almost all the materials we put out, because it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest concern I've heard at your doors and I've heard at the community. And I don't think the answer on it is more meetings. I think the answer on it is getting to results. And that means some really tough questions, like why are we solving crimes at such a low rate compared to the rest of the country or compared to similarly situated cities? Why has our detective corps fallen so much in strength? Why is our training so far behind other cities? I think we need to take real action on these issues. We've seen that statistical rise in crime. You guys have known me at this point for a while now. I can quote the numbers off the top of my head. My guess is you don't want me to do that again. You feel it, you know it, you feel that lack of safety. I think, for example, I wouldn't want to be the one who's saying, we've already been working on this, this is great. I think we need a change in this issue because what we're doing isn't working. I think we need to do something new, and we need to really reinvest in this training and our detective corps to provide that deterrence.
Thank you.
Well, so far, every idea that my opponents talked about is actually in process. So yes, we do need some changes. The consent decree is requiring the detective training that is happening. We've increased our detective corps. And I just want to say that sometimes when we hear about doubling down or increasing, really work on things, this is what really working on things look like. It's pressing for changes. It's pressing to bring a program for at-risk youth to our community and actually making it happen. It's pressing for more resources and then actually getting them. That is working on the issue, and we're not done.
Okay, the next question goes to Derek. At the March 19th debate, you cited Lincoln Common as an example of bad development in the ward. Many feel that way, but many would argue that in most respects it is an example of how large development should work in our ward. Throughout the design and construction of the project, the developer has modified plans to address concerns of the neighborhood, has respected the neighborhood's architectural heritage, preserved buildings where possible, regularly communicated with neighbors about construction progress, street and sidewalk closing, and other matters. How would you as Alderman have improved or changed Lincoln Common to meet your definition of good development?
Yeah, so I think the easy first place to start here is there was way too much retail space in the Lincoln Commons development. There was 130,000 square feet of retail in that development. Our neighborhood can't keep up with the retail we have. We need to, when we're looking at adding residential, it's all about the ratio, right? It's how many residents do you have for how much retail space? I know this is getting a little dorky, forgive me. When you're doing this, that ratio's changed with the advent of online shopping. The fact is, more and more folks in our community, especially younger families, are ordering a significant amount of their stuff online. We need more residents for the same amount of retail space. Or if we have less residents, which we do often with the deconversions, we have to look to getting a very, we have to be thoughtful about not building more retail space. And I think that was the big mistake with Lincoln Commons. I think we built way too much retail space. And as a result, we're going to cause more vacancies in our neighborhood. I also don't think the development came out that great. I think we have some real problems with how the process worked with that development, where it went on for years and years and years, where things were told one day that weren't told the next. And as a result, you got a development with way too much retail, and I think some serious problems with how it fits in our neighborhood. I don't think it's bad to do development. I think actually having active development in our community can be a good thing if it's done thoughtfully and community first. But I think it starts with not overbuilding our retail. And that's the first of a couple of problems, including the serious process issues.
Alderman?
So everyone was, well, many people were around to know that that was a very long, laborious process in which many, many points of view were heard. And I'm afraid that my opponent's discussion of this reflects a really lack of understanding of actually how retail works, for one thing, and also realizes what our community process found, which is we had a large majority of support for the final plan. And the reason that we created Lincoln Common was to create a new neighborhood crossroads to replace the 1.3 million people who used to come through the door at Children's Memorial. And so now there will be a neighborhood, a new commons with the kinds of storefronts that modern restaurateurs mostly, frankly, gyms want to be in. Some of our biggest problems is that our historic corridor don't have the kind of spaces that modern retailers want to use. However, by having a space where they can be, that will allow more people in general to come to the area.
So, really quick, I think this gets to the basis of the ratio question. It's just different now than it was in the late 80s and early 90s. We have less of a need for new retail space than we used to. And by adding so much retail space when we have so many vacancies, we're just creating more vacancies. There's a better way to do this. There's a more thoughtful way to do this. And that's what I look forward to doing as alderman. Very transparent processes where you know the start date and you know the end date in advance. You know when you'll have an opportunity for input, you'll know how the final decision will be made, and you'll know the goals. And I think one of those goals has to be not overbuilding retail.
Okay, so this is the last question we're going to have time for. Then we're going to have a short sponsor organization closing statement while the candidates work on their 2-minute closing statements. I want to return to a topic that's been mentioned a couple of times tonight, Alderman Smith. In the debate tonight and in mailings, you've criticized your opponent for his role in negotiating contracts with multiple city unions. As was pointed out earlier, at the time, you supported those negotiations, saying they provided a much-needed first step towards further and critical reforms to our pension system. I applaud both the governor's and Mayor Emanuel's leadership. You made a point tonight of talking about the unanimous ruling in the Supreme Court, Illinois Supreme Court, against that. But at the time, you said they were wrong. Do you still feel they were wrong?
Well, yes, I do. However, we all wanted pension reform very badly. And we have to depend on the experts who were providing us with these alternatives. And Mr. Lindblom has really started his campaign in every single one of those campaign banners saying that he's the expert, that he ran at that hard problem. And really the problem is that he really got run over. And if you're going to represent yourself to be the expert, then embrace the fact that you didn't negotiate some of the fundamental parts of the deal that really must have needed to be done, including something very fundamental like a covenant not to sue. Because what happened is, we all relied on that expertise. And then the union sued, and and then time passed, and a ruling came down, and then we had no choice to do what we did. Of course we all wanted pension reform. We still want pension reform, and that's why I'm calling for going for a constitutional amendment to help fix our issues. So the real issue here is that when a candidate asserts themselves to be someone, he really owed you the entire story. And that's really what the issue is right here. We both want pension reform. Everybody wants pension reform. But don't hold yourself out to be an expert to something that you really didn't do well on, and that we really have been and then say that we haven't been working on it all this time. This is some of the problems of the kind of negative mail you see.
I have no idea what any of that means. I put this reform forward. At the time, Alderman Smith thought this was a great reform. In fact, on this covenant not to sue issue, you can't have a covenant not to sue because it's an individual right of action. Anyone could sue. We knew it was going to the Supreme Court. We knew if we lost, it would blaze a trail with the first compromise. We knew if we won, we'd actually have fixed the hardest problem. And the alderman knew this. She said this, actually, in her op-ed praising my reform bill, that municipal employees and laborers have reached a good faith compromise and have come to the table ahead of other unions. They also have not sued to block reform as other unions have. She knew some of them did and some of them didn't when she wrote the op-ed. The fact is, look, it's easy to be against things that are happening. Chicago has really hard problems. The alderman's had 8 years to work on them as an alderman and hasn't done anything except written an op-ed saying how great the work I did was. As a staffer, I ran at these problems. I took the risk. Yeah, you're going to have things where there's difficulties, but I think we're better off and we should continue to run at these problems.
So we've taken risks. I've taken risks as your alderman for the entire time that I've been here. I've stood up on Lincoln Yards for my community. So when we're talking about risks, I think that's what I want to know is, where has Mr. Lindblom been? He's never said a word at a meeting, never took a position. He's saying he's listening. But what's the difference between listening and lack of leadership? I think you've heard from our community that we wanted to make sure that Lincoln Yards met our needs as a community for open space. Many people in this room stood up at a meeting. You weren't there.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Okay, so sorry for not paying attention there. So that's the last question. We've got some more good ones, but time is up. So Diana Feldhaber from President Wrightwood Neighbors is going to come up and make a closing statement while the candidates are polishing their, I'm sure, already eloquent closing statements. So let's inspire them, give them a big hand for the debate so far. Diana?
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you and the audience for being so respectful and attentive and for coming out this evening. It's really important that we get firsthand knowledge about the positions that our candidates are taking, and so I really admire you for taking the times out of your evening to come and do that with us. I also want to thank once again Steppenwolf Theater for letting us use this perfect space for this event. They're great neighbors, and I hope you are all subscribers. And if you're not, why not? Wrightwood Neighbors, Lincoln Central, and Park West associations are not-for-profit neighbor associations dedicated to enhancing the quality of life on the streets where we live. We support our local schools, help to influence the quality of local development, sponsor park creation and maintenance, summer movies, fun neighborhood events, and important events like tonight's debate. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join. Have a voice in your neighborhood. The Lincoln Park Chamber of Commerce has been playing an active role in the success of Lincoln Park business since 1947. Membership in the LPCC provides you with access to marketing and promotional opportunities, networking and community-oriented events, business advocacy, access to discount programs, partnerships, and much more. If you own a business in Lincoln Park, then joining the Lincoln Park Chamber of Commerce is the first step to ensuring your success. Finally, I want to thank our candidates, Alderman Michelle Smith and Derek Lindblom, for participating in this evening's debate. With that, Alderman Smith has the opportunity to give us her closing statement. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Earlier, I asked you to listen for real accomplishments and to question vague assertions. An alderman's job is a unique combination of the smallest details of our daily lives and the largest questions we face as a city. My goal has been to make sure every kid can go to a great school from toddler to high school. That's why we've won $60 million for our schools, more investment in 7 years than in the previous 40. Our goal is to make sure that kids have safe places to play, which is why we've rebuilt almost every public playground. Our goal has been to rejuvenate our retail corridors, and vacancy rates are the lowest since the recession. Armitage is thriving, Lincoln Avenue is rejuvenated, and we will get that law passed to close the loophole that allows landlords to leave their spaces empty. We have made progress on public safety with more to do, with more than 136 new police officers, new tech, and greater cooperation with our state's attorney. We have started down the path towards fiscal responsibility and discipline, and I will not vote for any property tax increase. Everyone here knows we are on the brink of great change. I am proud I stood up for what was right when many considered it political suicide, especially about Lincoln Yards and ethics. This campaign boils down to who will keep us moving forward and who has never, not even in the last year, stood up and fought for change. In endorsing Lori Lightfoot, my opponent said, "We need leaders to pull City Council out of the old Chicago way and into a new day." I couldn't agree more. That is why I am proud to have Lori Lightfoot's endorsement and her request that you return me to City Council to work with her. We will be a great team. It has been my honor to serve you. I hope you will honor me with your vote so we can finish what we have started together. Thank you, Kenneth, and thank you.
Sure. First, thanks for moderating. Thanks for hosting. Thanks all of you for coming. We're at a crucial time in Chicago. We got a chance to change so many of the challenges we've had in this old Chicago way for so long. I agree with my opponent. I'm going to vote for Lori Lightfoot. I think both of us are going to support that reform agenda. But we also have real serious financial problems. You know, I think when we've talked about what have we done, you've seen with me a career, even as a staffer, about pushing at the hardest problems with our finances. Problems my opponent thought were great solutions at the time to fix what really ails our community. We have serious financial issues. We really need to get the heart of the structural problems in City Council. That means banning side jobs, including like the one my opponent had for years. It means serious things like term limits and thinking about the size of City Council. It also means getting at those financial problems and that pension and legacy debt overhang that hurt all our property taxes. You have my promise not to raise your property taxes and not to institute a city income tax, as has been discussed in this campaign. We can't push young families and seniors out of our community. We're losing some of the anchors that grew and developed this community, that turned around our schools and did so much that my personal family benefits from, and all of us. We can't push these folks out of the community, and we can't stop new young families from moving in. There's a real opportunity for change here. Change on our local issues, like modernizing our alderman's office so you always get a call back. So we know exactly how long your problem's going to take to fix, and we can tell you up front. We know when we're going to deliver food to your house. If we're running a company, we should know about how long it's going to take to fix your lights. But it also means going after the big issues too, like safety, like real ethics reform, and like really getting after those financial issues. I'm running to be that change. I'm running to change that status quo City Council way. The rest of Chicago doesn't look like it's 1950 anymore, and we shouldn't have the ethics and finances in 1950 in Chicago. I'm running to be that change, and I'm hopeful you'll elect me, and I'm asking for your vote today.
Time. That concludes this evening's debate. Let's give them another round of applause for a great debate.